Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kvetchfest. I'm Jen.
And I'm Debbie.
And today we're going to talk about our obsession with true crime. I just looked at my Spotify Wrapped for this year, and I think I'm in the top 5% of listeners who listen to true crime, almost exclusively podcasts about true crime and documentaries. So, is something wrong with me? Why am I obsessed with true crime? What is it about those stories and those really dark things that happen in our world that I am drawn to, that collectively, as a group of people, we are drawn to? We're going to unravel that today, but I think as we unravel that, I'm still unraveling it for myself. But I think part of it is the mystery of wanting to understand how something happened, why something happened, who did what they did and why, circumstances of people's lives. I think pulls them into certain situations that we could never fathom if we were in it ourselves. That's the only time we could. Also, I don't know, who knows, people's mental health. There's so much to unravel. I can't even, there's so much to talk about here. But I also think a lot of people like me might see themselves as victims and want to, or potential victims in a world that wants to erase us, doesn't like us, doesn't like women. And we feel like we have to be prepared for anything. And I think in that way, is listening to these stories makes you feel prepared for that kind of world that we live in, sadly. What about you, Mom? What's your obsession with true crime? And let's unravel this together.
Yeah, I think it's the mystery of it all. For me, you said pretty much that's the foundation, I think, of why people are interested. I think people have always been interested in crime stories in books, magazines, and then on radio and then on television. So I think it's always kind of titillating and tantalizing to read about how people get into a predicament like that and why the perpetrator does what they do. And because it's very hard for us to think about people who can do something egregious, like murdering somebody or, really harming or trying to do
Mm,
that. But I think we basically all have that within us. We just have lots
yeah.
of stopgaps that other people perhaps do not have. And then
Mm,
there are those people who are born with a certain psychopath or sociopath's nature that others of us aren't. And then there's people who are raised in situations that might create that for them. So
mm,
I don't think if you study abnormal psychology, you're going to they're going to touch on that kind of stuff, and it is part of the human experience to be violent. And some people act on it, and some people, like I said, have stopgaps and don't.
right.
But I don't think there's a person in this world who could say they never thought of harming themselves or others. So
Sure.
at some point in their lives, it may be fleeting, or it might be more something that's
Oppressive.
ongoing with them. And
Yeah.
there's something,
Hmm.
and some people seek help for that,
Hmm.
and some people don't. But for me, I think, yeah, the crime itself is, whoa, I can't believe that happened. But I think for me, and this is going to be difficult because we all have certain feelings about law enforcement historically, but I try to put that stuff aside because when I watch these documentaries or crime dramas on TV or listen to them on a podcast, I really am taken with how emotionally involved law enforcement does get with families who are
Some of
trying to
them,
figure
yes.
out what happened. And
Yeah,
I,
totally.
yeah, yeah. I think there's a real true community that develops within the law enforcement and the family to get to that point. And there are some law enforcement, like detectives and things, who may retire before a case is solved, and yet they still think about that case or try to work the case on their own
Hmm.
time because they've made a
Yes.
promise to the
Yes.
family of the victim. So I think I'm
Yes.
taken with how they are able to go back, especially cold cases, and like there's one
Mhm.
or two things that they missed that help them solve a crime. So I
Yeah,
think
or like with
that's,
the addition of DNA testing and all of that, that can be
oh yeah, and
retested. Mhm.
yeah, and the genealogical.
Yeah. Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah, sounds funny. DNA that they're doing now with familial
Mhm.
DNA. I know they're
Yes.
trying to work on the Ramsey case with that now.
Right.
The John Benet
Yes, that's
Ramsey case. The
yes, I remember
father's
that
like,
was
now we have this, you
yeah,
know.
very
Yeah,
iconic
yeah,
story.
yeah,
Yeah, murder when I was
yeah,
growing up. I mean, that was I can
yeah.
remember being in the grocery stores and seeing tabloids of her, those pageant outfits and stuff, and how yeah, it just kind of shuffled me through the 90s in a way. I mean, yeah, Princess Diana as well. I mean, those are two major like not that that was well, who knows? There's a lot of conspiracies around that
Right,
as well. But
right.
yeah, the 90s were really a challenging
Yeah.
time, I think, for families going through a huge grievance. But I want to touch on too that when you're talking about law enforcement being involved, obviously, in these crimes that happen, there's a lot of themes. There's two themes that happen, and that is one where you get these law enforcement individuals who get really close to these families because they're in it for years at a time trying to solve these cases. And then the other
Correct.
part is the frustration around law enforcement because they do things wrong so
Hmm.
often and in so many different law enforcement agencies all over the country, all over the world. But so that is also really upsetting to go back and hear about John Bonet's case and hearing that law enforcement just like let people inside the house and didn't treat it as a crime scene just makes my blood boil because and then at the time and then also I think about myself and it's like if you don't have strong boundaries around how to relate to people or how to manage a scene like that, then of course things are going to get messed up. So to just allow people to have I'm sure it must be so challenging too because you're trying to hold this family dealing with a huge upsetting thing that just occurred and you want them to be in their safe space, which is their home. But at the same time, it's like, well, maybe this is not the place to do that. And let's move the family somewhere else so that they can, deal with what they have to deal with, but also make sure the crime scene is situated so that no one disturbs it. And I think so many times you hear that if it's a missing person case, then they don't treat these places as crime scenes, but it's like it is. Like you don't know that it's not. So why wouldn't you just at the bare minimum treat anything and everything like a crime scene? So I get so frustrated with law enforcement because they just don't do their jobs in the ways that you think they should and in the ways that they in common sense ways. They assume a lot of things about people like, oh, that person just left on their own volition and they don't listen to families and they wait and the waiting is what hurts people the most in a lot of these situations is waiting around until they feel up to solving this case. It's I get so frustrated about that. Just time and time again, you just hear this police department didn't follow up. Why not? I'm a big crime junkie fan too, so they touch on that all the time in their episodes where they're just like, ugh, it makes my blood boil. I'm seething. She's just like, why wouldn't you do that? When you listen to a lot of true crime, I mean, you start to understand the patterns of what goes wrong very early on in a case. And you're just like, and then you add in underrepresented groups and minorities, and then it gets worse. So it's very frustrating. But it's also like hard too because I feel it's kind of, how do I feel? I like true crime, and it also feels weird to say that. I understand it's like kind of this strange thing to like because it's someone's worst day or someone's worst experiences, and you're enjoying the story of that. But I don't know. What are you thinking, Mom? You're thinking the wheels are turning, trying to
Well,
understand what
I
I'm
made a
saying right
list
now.
of things, and I think you've checked them all off.
Oh no.
Yeah. Um, I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. No, so from an older person's vantage point,
Yeah.
having been raised differently about law enforcement and also naively about law enforcement as well, I think that yes, to the outside world, sometimes it seems like law enforcement isn't taking charge soon enough, but there are laws in place that also protect the individual. So if I decide to leave my home and not tell anybody I'm going and I'm over 21, I'm allowed to do that and they don't have to investigate my missingness for a good 48 hours
But
after,
that's not
in 24
true.
hours.
That's not
Well,
true
that
though. That's a fake law. It's not
is it
real.
a fake law? So I'm misinformed.
I think so because I think basically on every Crime Junkie episode that I've listened to, that they'll say
I
that you do not have to wait 24 to 48 hours to file a missing persons report. Is that what you're saying?
no, I think you can file a
Oh,
report,
okay.
but
Yes,
I
but a
think
lot of
law
times police
enforcement
departments will say that you can't, they will not search for them until, or that
because
you
they
can't file it. Yeah. So,
right, because I think that what they're trying to publicize is that this is a person with freedoms and they're an
sure.
adult and they're
Right.
allowed to go off on their own
Yeah.
volition. And until we know whether this was something egregious and they didn't go off on their own, we can't really try to capture them and bring them back because that's another problem on the other side. That's a liability issue on the other side, right? But
I
I
hear
get
that.
that
Yeah.
you're saying that time is of the essence. And I think with
Hmm.
children, I think with adults, with humans under the age of 18, they're much more responsive.
Yes, but
But
also let's talk about the
or
80s and
21.
90s because the 80s and 90s, I mean, that was the milk carton era. And these police were not investigating children going missing. And so many times they would say, "Oh, they're delinquents," or they just ran away from home. So what do you say about that? Is that just lazy police work and they don't think that or believe these families, or what is that about? Why does that happen?
Yeah, I think that it takes human beings a long time to understand how life has changed.
Mhm.
So, you know what I'm saying? So we're looking at what every generation before the generation that comes says life was more innocent. Well, I think that ship has sailed with life is
Yeah,
more innocent because I don't really think life was ever really innocent. We just
agreed.
never knew so much about what was going on as we do today. So I think there was this pervasive idea that life was innocent, mostly in white communities. Let's just say that
Mhm.
where these things couldn't possibly happen, and so the wheels to move people to find missing people or children, or to even believe that children could be abused,
Mhm.
was very slow because we allowed a certain amount of abuse with children. We
Right.
kind of still do. If you spare the rod, spoil the child kind of crap, you believe that's okay to hit your child. So abuse on certain levels was kind of not
Normal.
really thought of as something bad or
Yeah.
believable. But I
Mhm.
think it was more, let me say the word I think is more acceptable. We have history of families whose father used belts on them and all kinds of stuff because
Mhm.
people somehow couldn't think outside the box and say, gee, that really harmed me as a child. I
Right,
don't really
maybe
want to do
not do
that to
that.
my child. But more than not, I hear, well, I was hit and I'm okay. I'm like,
Oh, I hear that all
really?
the time. Or it was
Are
from
you
love.
okay?
My
Right,
parent loved
right.
me and that's why they hit me. I'm like, "Oh my
Right. Well, that's a
goodness."
double message. So I
Yeah.
think that the wheels of lawfulness and what becomes legal to do and what's not legal to do or symptoms just don't
Yes.
catch up.
I agree, and I wanna point out the fact that in the 80s and 90s, and even still today in a lot of ways, a lot of law enforcement was men, and I think that perpetuated a lot of cases going south because of not understanding or not believing women.
Hmm.
Because it was, let's talk about moms. I mean, the moms are the ones going to law enforcement a lot of the time. I'm not saying dads don't, but I'm just saying there's a lot of cases where it's single parents, single moms,
Hmm.
or aunts, grandmothers, things like that, and they're not
Hmm.
believed by the men that are running the law enforcement agencies. And then men themselves, I think there's this, how do I say this? Lack of awareness of underprivileged or like systems of oppression, obviously back in the 80s and 90s for sure, still today,
Hmm.
but that didn't allow for the believability from police to, they just see what goes on in certain neighborhoods and that reinforces their belief in a certain demographic of people causing harm or violence or whatever, but they don't think about why that is, like systemically. So I think it perpetuates a lot of ways that law enforcement doesn't do the work for the communities that they're serving. And then it's also this idea, I think, that men in that time in the 80s and 90s just let things slide for their own personal or professional gains. So because cases were based on if you move up or get promoted, things like that. And who knows? I mean, there's so much stuff going on too behind the scenes where it's like it being in cahoots with the local government and all of that. Or who knows? A lot of people that I think are in law enforcement also perhaps perpetuated crimes of their own. You know what I mean? So it's just there's so much to unpack in the ways that these things were left covered up and not ever fully investigated.
Well, sure. I mean, it took a long time for women to be understood in all kinds of crimes, especially
Hmm.
in rape and in
Yeah, especially.
prostitution. So
Hmm.
the woman was identifiable in a prostitute if they were
Sex
arrested,
workers. Yeah.
But the Johns weren't.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
Women had to go on trial in front of their rapists.
Yeah.
Why, right?
Still do.
So, and
Yep.
that was earlier than the 80s, obviously, and there's laws now that have changed a lot of that. Now we have rape kits and that kind of stuff. My hope for the future is that we become much more considerate of the emotionality and the trauma involved with anybody who's involved in a crime, men,
Yeah.
women, and children. But
Hmm.
yes, there's definitely you saw John Benet Ramsey all over the place when you were growing up, is because she was a cute white little girl from a very
Hmm.
well privileged family, a wealthy family, and the other part of that was that she was doing these pageants, and that became a whole controversy about that and over sexualizing young girls, and maybe that brings on that kind of thing. But see, when we say stuff like that, we're still giving men all this leeway to be,
Yes. I know.
perpetuators of violent crime against girls and women. So
Right.
I don't buy any of that. So I think that you mentioned a racial component, definitely.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that there is a dismissiveness
Yes. Oh,
that does
dismissiveness.
happen, and I think some families are able to gain resources much faster and are able to move through that. Whereas other folks who don't have resources really find themselves in a pickle, especially with false confessions and that kind of thing, which
Yeah.
just tear me up. Oh, and there's a guy in prison for 35, 40 flipping years who didn't do something. I can
Oh,
just barely hold my shit together, pardon the
I
S
know.
word,
No, I
because
know.
I feel so horrible for them. But yeah,
Raging.
it is. So I think it's really important that people, know their rights
Hmm.
before they go into a room with a person who
Yeah.
is going
Get a
to
lawyer
perhaps, yeah, get a lawyer, know your rights. And
and shut up. Don't say anything.
getting a lawyer has a whole other thing going on. Well, you get a lawyer, that must mean you're guilty. I
I
mean,
know.
so yeah, right? So it's a whole
You
thing.
can't win.
So there's all these protocols, and I want to believe, and that might be the boomer in me. I do want to believe that law enforcement at this time has better science, better attitudes, more understanding how to treat people from different diverse backgrounds, and or are learning to.
Hmm.
It's a
It's
learning
too
curve.
slow though.
Right, but then on the opposite side, there's a lot of community members who are not also very positive in their behavior towards law enforcement. You
Well,
know,
would you be if they were born out of slavery? I mean, these police in general were made to protect private property.
oh no,
And
I
then
understand
so
what you're
like
saying.
and it hasn't changed at all. So I don't know that if
Right.
I was one that was a person that was targeted by the police force, I don't know that I would have positive associations because you don't grow up to have positive associations because they're
No,
harming
I
your
I
community.
totally I get what you're saying totally.
Yeah.
But I think that on the side of law enforcement, it's got to be, it's scary on both sides,
Well, yeah, and
you
I
know.
think there's a lot of training that doesn't happen. The training period to become a police officer is very short,
Yes.
and then they're yielding weapons.
Yes.
So that's a recipe for disaster. And I have no interest in becoming a police officer by any means, but I I mean it is scary. You have to drive towards danger. You have to run towards
Right.
it. And
Right.
that's not a profession that I think is very easy necessarily, but also it's a choice. It is a choice to become a cop. So,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
And unfortunately, you can be as prepared as possible and find yourself in a situation where fear takes over.
yeah,
So, you know, yeah, it's very hard discussion because we don't want to cast aspersions in either direction.
I do.
But okay, that's fair.
Based on my
But
social justice and human rights master's degree, I think I can. But anyway,
okay,
go
well,
on.
you may have a lot more background, a solid foundation than I do, and
That's
maybe
okay.
I'm limited. I'm limited in how I can talk about the history,
Sure, sure.
perhaps, but
Yes.
I think that, and look, when you're watching it, even when you're watching, Dateline or 2020 or 48 Hours, it's pretty glossy.
Yeah.
It's like watching a Law and Order. You know what's going to happen the first part of the hour, the middle, and the end. Yes, it's still
Right.
intriguing. It's still intriguing to watch it, so you
Mhm.
do get when I said, I find that law enforcement feels sympathetic towards family. It's because the stories that they're choosing to show, the law enforcement that they're choosing to document, do feel that
Do.
way,
Yes, absolutely,
right?
and there's lots of investigators that do, obviously, and to be an
Right.
investigator, I think would be a really fulfilling job and career. I think that's so necessary.
Yeah,
I wanted
it's
to
like
oh, what were
making
we gonna
putting
say?
together a puzzle. It's
It
like putting
is,
together a puzzle. Yeah.
it is putting together a puzzle. I mean, you really have to
Yeah.
come in without bias and figure out these parts and put things
Right.
together that you can't see. I mean, yeah, it's amazing what people can do. I was gonna say, on the flip side of true crime documentaries, I'm gonna admit something right now, which it's a little embarrassing, but
Dun, dun, dun.
I love shows about cops, like The Rookie. Do you watch The Rookie?
I have not, but I know the actor, and I do like the person who does that show,
Yeah. So
that
it's
actor.
funny to me because I'm like, oh, let me watch a show. What are they called? Procedurals. I'm into procedural TV dramas. Okay. So I think it's so funny because, yeah, there's a lot of nuance, of course, with any profession and any situation. That the flip side of me saying I want to cast aspersions to police officers, and yet also I understand the nuance of the work that goes into that. If you are an advocate for, if you have empathy and you're a police officer, maybe it's different, but you know what I mean. It's funny to me that The Rookie and these other shows that are FBI agents or things like that I find fun and interesting and entertaining because they're going to go stop crime. You know what I mean? Which doesn't really happen, but it's a show, so it's way more fun.
All right, you're not looking. It's not the nitty gritty real life experience of what did happen
Yeah.
and how it affects the family forever.
Right.
And yes, of course,
Yeah.
my age group grew up with Dragnet, and
Yeah.
when you look back at that, and then you look at some of and then maybe Hill Street Blues,
Hmm.
that was very gritty compared to what I was raised with, and then so compelling. Even Cagney and Lacey having two women, um, that was pretty new for the time, and talking about subject matter that hadn't been talked about on TV. So there are fiction shows that do try to bring up the morality and
Hmm.
that kind of thing of that day,
Yes.
and then there are these nonfiction, which is really frightening because there are people out there
Hmm.
and we need to be careful. But it's true that most of the crime against people are people that we know.
I
And
know.
that's what
Freaky.
I think that's what makes watching these shows really compelling, because you
Hmm.
wonder to yourself, how can a person really believe that killing off their spouse is going to enhance their life by getting $100,000 life insurance policy and a new girlfriend? I mean, it's
Yeah.
just outrageous, because you wonder, where did they lose their grip on reality,
Hmm.
that they have planned on this and will
Hmm.
go through with it, and think that this is a lot of money
Mhm.
and think that they're going to get away with it and that the person that they're choosing to be with is going to stay with them.
I know. It's
It's just there's so
asinine.
many moving ridiculous parts that just don't seem to like compute.
Don't click. Yeah.
I mean, what?
What are they thinking? I know. It's
Yeah,
like, well,
and it
are they
happens
thinking?
time and time again.
I know
So,
it does.
yeah,
It's a continual type of crime. Yeah.
like
I
people,
oh,
yeah, I was
what
just
were you
gonna say
saying?
people decide murder is better than divorce, and some people believe that. I mean, in their
I
minds
know.
because
Yes.
they don't want to be judged.
Right.
I
It's so bizarre
I
to me.
don't
I know. I don't
understand.
get it. It's like divorce is always easier, I think, but just move on. Unless that person's abusive or
Well, no,
something. That
yes,
and that's
right.
but that's different. We're not talking about that. But
Well, these
yeah,
people are
I
greedy. They
yeah.
don't want to pay child support.
Right.
They don't,
Yeah, that's
right.
the thing.
They
That's
want
the
to
thing.
eradicate the whole, that whole family sometimes, not just
Right.
the spouse,
Yeah, familicide.
and
Yeah, it's
and
sad.
just clean that up. And we're just going to move
Mhm.
right into this situation. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's not toxic. I mean, I
No.
don't, I mean, it's
Yeah,
just,
well, that's a whole other episode on people who are with people who are in prison or have relationships with people who are murderers. I mean, there's so many things
oh,
to
that
go
that's
off
a
of
whole
there.
other thing.
That's a whole
But I was
other
thinking there's another slant to this, and also the pathology and the just the psychology behind what appears to be a normal functioning
right.
human being who all of a sudden a switch goes off,
Right.
and how all of us wonder if we have that
Mhm.
switch,
Yeah.
right? And
I
how do
think
we keep
so.
that
Yeah.
switch from turning
On.
on or off,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know?
I know. What's interesting to me is I think about this, and it's kind of weird, but when I watch true crime documentaries and they're cold cases from today, let's say, or within the last 10 years, and I'm like, gosh, how do people get away with crime when there's DNA? Because I think about myself, I'm like, if I were to go out to commit a crime right now, I would definitely be found just based on probably missing a key part of my plan or just like dropping a hair or like I don't know. How do people and how are there still cold cases today? It's kind of fascinating to think about because I can understand it back before we had enhanced DNA testing. And I think a lot of cold cases are from that time for sure. Even before cold cases
Oh yeah,
from time.
that's where they're
Uh,
mostly from. Yeah,
that's where they're mostly from, but I'm also like people
right.
commit crimes today that are still haven't haven't been solved. So it's fascinating to me that that's something that is still occurring.
Well, I think that for me, that is fascinating. What I find also additionally fascinating is that we have a lot of cameras now.
Right.
Not only do we have cameras, but we have cell phones and
Mhm.
Fitbits and
Mhm.
Apple Watches and all those things that track us. We have
Track
air
you.
tags. We have computers in our cars. So the idea that you can tell a law enforcement, well, I wasn't there when you're pinging, when you're on fire in this one area,
Right.
technologically you're pinging so big that they know you're there. And yet these
Right.
people still lie and lie and lie because people will lie, and we know this because where are we right now in this world? People will
Right.
lie through their teeth and get away with it
I know.
when they shouldn't be, and then they lie when they're in being detained and generally don't get away with it. But it takes
Mhm.
time, even with all that, for a case to be made that the district
Mhm.
attorney will take on and that the
Right.
prosecutor will think they have enough teeth in, right?
That's the other thing, yeah, is going through
Right,
the back end of what makes a case. I mean,
right.
that's so interesting to me too. Oh, you have to have enough evidence and it can't just be witnesses and the witness statements because witnesses are not always obviously reliable. So you have to have a very reliable witness. And
Yeah.
thinking back to, I've been playing this game where I try to remember people or things, and I'm like, oh, it's very faulty, even minutes after. That's a whole other interesting aspect of it too, like the justice system and how cases go through the justice system and how that's also flawed and juries, how juries are selected. I mean, it's a whole thing that I don't think a lot of people know or understand, because I had to do my own research on this and I still don't know a lot of information about the back end, but I do know it mostly from listening to podcasts about these things. So it's a whole thing.
Right.
It's so much.
And you gotta, I feel on for both sides, the family who has lost somebody and can't feels like they can't get justice,
Mhm.
and the lawyers who feel like they have a good case and can't bring it, and or lose it on technicality, or it's a hung
Yeah.
jury. The frustrations are on both
Mhm.
sides, because
Right.
I don't want to live in a country where we don't have laws in place and we don't have
Mhm.
systems that protect people. But then you wonder, some of these laws they may stymie the ability for things to be solved.
Yeah.
So it's hard because we're just humans, and sometimes I think as human beings and what we've created is pretty freaking miraculous.
Mhm.
And there's on the
Mhm.
other side, I also feel like some of the things that we've created are horrific.
Toxic. Yeah, I know.
Right?
Mhm.
So,
I know. It's one of those
you
things
know,
I don't know that I don't know how you get justice in situations where there's a murder. Like, I don't know what that looks like, because I think a lot of people talk about being held accountable. And I think that's
right.
a major way to get justice, is like holding someone accountable. I don't know that it's putting someone behind bars for the rest of their life. I don't know if that changes. We talk about restorative justice. That's like a whole thing. And like, how do you actually work, be in community that is also harming people? And it's very complicated. And there's this whole book that talks about our prisons obsolete, and goes into what it would look like to not have prisons and all of that. But anyway, what I mean to say is, like, yeah, justice and what that looks like for people who endure horrific crimes. And is it just accountability? Is it restorative justice? Is it a little bit of both? Is there other ways we can do harm reduction? What does the world look like if our systems look different too? So that's something I think about as well.
Yes, and there are other countries that are doing better jobs with restorative justice and that kind of thing. But,
Hmm.
and not to discount that because I'm not, but I'm just saying,
Hmm.
I can imagine as a family of somebody who had a crime against them, the idea of a person being released from prison, the person who did
Yeah,
that being released from prison has to be a big slap in the face to them. I get
totally.
that.
Hmm.
And I
Me
know
too.
there are families on both sides who will say, I don't want the death penalty. I want this guy to live every single day knowing what he did for the rest, or she did for the rest of their lives, because my person can't lead that life.
Yeah.
So there's that,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Whereas the death penalty, and the death penalty is a whole other thing, because
I
we've got
know.
people on death row for years and years and
Yeah.
years and years
I
and
don't
years.
I don't
But
believe in the death
that seems
penalty
more final to some people and more an eye for an eye.
I
I'm not
know.
an eye for an eye person,
Either.
so generally speaking, but
Yeah.
I can understand, I do empathize and I understand the anger
Hmm.
involved in that. I
Yeah.
also We've also seen cases, because the two of us watch this stuff, where someone has actually gone to the prison and become created a relationship with the person who committed the crime, knowing
Right.
what that person's crappy life was like, which created the situation which created the crime.
Right.
So there's a lot of very forgiving.
And
It's just mind-boggling,
it
the
is
different.
mind-boggling. There's a whole
Yeah.
thing that's fascinating. It brings up this idea too of, if we lived in an equitable world, would crime would still exist, but would it be the way it is now? Things like that I think about too. I think a lot about how much less crime there could be if we had things that we needed. If our basic needs were met. And I don't just mean like a cot and water. I mean an apartment that is functioning. You know what I mean? I feel like if we had our basic needs met, and then a little bit and then some, I don't know that people would want to murder their wives so they didn't have to pay alimony. You know what I mean? Or not alimony, child support.
Or both. I
Or
mean, if
both.
you're
Yeah.
very wealthy, you have to pay both. And look, very wealthy people have killed spouses because of that
Hmm.
too. So
Right.
w- I don't know
No
that
one's
wealth is the
safe.
indi- Right. I don't know that wealth is the indicator here, but I do agree with you that in general, if you have a society that's more equitable
Hmm.
or that people's basic needs are met, and I'm talking about having a house with structure, an
Hmm.
apartment, an abode with
Yeah.
structure and food and heating and
Yes.
clothing and a universal,
Basic income.
thank you, that would definitely lower. I can't see that it wouldn't lower the
Hmm.
perpetuation of even minor crimes,
Right. Exactly.
right?
Hmm.
Right? Because all these are gateway crimes to larger and more hideous things that can happen. So the
Hmm.
less gateway crimes we have, the better off we are. And then on top of that, if we had that, you're always going to have people in society who are going to be outside or on the,
Fringes. Yeah.
yes, on the fringes or
Hmm.
not in the bell curve and all that stuff. And if they're not causing problems, that's great. But if they have problems, then we need to also have a better psychological, you
Response and
know,
not criminalize people who are like
right.
houseless or things like that. Yes. Hmm. Hmm.
Exactly. And I also think that when you have a more calming of society when it comes to those needs, you
Hmm.
have better parenting. And
Hmm.
better
Yes.
parenting produces kids that have more understanding of right and wrong, and they're less apt to do
Cause
things
harm.
that are
Yeah.
against their better judgment because they
Hmm.
have better judgment. If schooling wasn't expensive, if
Hmm.
trade schools were more available, if colleges weren't as expensive, people could avail themselves to becoming better humans rather than having to be kept down because there's only a certain amount of money for those people in the middle and higher, and there's not a lot in the middle right now and higher, and the
Hmm.
lower just keep getting lower and lower. I mean, I as I get older and older, I want people used to say, well, we need equality. No, we need equity.
Yeah.
Not everybody's going to be able to get to the same level, but
Hmm.
everybody should have the same jumping off point.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
they do with that is great, but you'll have a much calmer situation, in my opinion, if everybody basically had what they needed,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I mean, I was in a
Hmm.
group yesterday where we talked about, we had different scenarios for deprivation and which scenario would we pick if we were deprived
Mm.
of something in our life. So
Oh, wow.
there was this, the starting off point was, have you been deprived in your life and why? And can you
Hmm.
talk about that?
Mm.
And what everybody's idea of deprivation is different, of course.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then there was options of you can choose, you could, there was a fantasy option to choose. One was living with a tribe out as an anthropologist out with a tribe that's never been connected to any sophisticated society. And well, I shouldn't say sophisticated because theirs is very, it could be
It
very
is sophisticated.
sophisticated,
Yeah.
but I'm saying modern society. And another one was, what if you were in prison and what would, and you could get tokens, what would you spend your tokens on to help your
Mm.
deprivation during the time? And it was a shortened period of imprisonment. But, and as an anthropology minor, I chose being with a tribe. But, and it was interesting because in the group, I was the only one that chose that option.
Hmm.
The idea of being imprisoned scared the crap out of me, and I don't care how many tokens I got. I don't want to be there.
No, I know.
So,
I have dreams about being in
yeah,
imprisoned. It's
yeah,
scary. It
yeah.
doesn't feel good.
Right. So every man's ceiling is every man's floor. One man's ceiling is another man's floor. But when we're talking about deprivation and we're talking about crime, it's really the way our society is structured that causes this. Now,
Hmm.
look,
Right.
crimes have been done in wealthy society. Anybody can commit a crime. But
Yeah.
overall, what you're talking about is privatization of prisons and rallying
Hmm.
people in, and for many different reasons, mostly due to racial reasons. And I'm just saying that when you take things away from people and you haven't given them, when you initially take things away and you've
Hmm.
never ever given them anything back,
Hmm.
how do you expect people to react?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, as I said, I started out saying, as I get older, I want to see more equity.
Me too.
I'm not saying, and I'm going to repeat this again, I'm not saying that you can give everybody the same exact thing. They're all going to do the same exact thing with it. You don't give everybody the same exact thing. You give everybody what they need, and you see what happens after that
Mhm.
point,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because you're always going to have society where there's going to be people who are going to innovate, and people who are going to be deeper thinkers, and people who are going to be more the ones that are the foundational workers. And it's kind of like Plato's society. You're going to have all these different types of
Mhm.
people, and that's great because that's what makes a society meaningful, as long
Mhm.
as you respect everybody's level of
Mhm.
work and level
Yes.
of right
It's a whole
their
thing.
their level of humanity. And that's where it gets tough for people,
Mhm.
because for the most part we're afraid that we're going to get harmed physically, and we're also afraid we're going to get majorly harmed monetarily
Mhm. And
because
our
we're
and
greedy.
monetarily is our means for survival, sadly. So,
Right, but some people have way more than they need
right.
and should
Very true.
be filtering that
Too many
out.
pies.
And some people do, but
Mhm.
many, the society is not structured that way. We have this success oriented stitch, and success generally means the making of money. So I see that it's compelling for us to watch all these things, because we're just watching whatever it is, 2 hours or an hour of a human being's behavior
Mhm.
and how they got to that point. No matter
Right.
what walk of life they're from, how
Yeah.
the heck did they make
That choice
these
and why.
decisions?
Right.
You
Mhm.
know,
It is. It's a study of humans in a way, and the situations they find themselves in or put themselves
right?
in, I
Or
guess.
put themselves in,
Yeah.
right? Or conjure without asking.
Right. A lot of
Or
assumptions.
there's a lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
religion is part of it,
Mhm.
and inheritances are part of it. I don't know why I can't say that. And
Been drinking. Just kidding.
yeah, water.
Good.
My
Stay
favorite choice.
hydrated.
Yes, and inequities within families. He likes you better. She likes,
Right.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing. I
Emotional
mean,
inequities.
right,
Yeah. Yeah. Where you
right,
fit in your family. I mean, there's so many dynamics about that too. Yeah.
right. So I think that's why people, I mean, a lot of people, like to watch these things, because I think there's more to it than just the crime and what happened to the person. It's more about how everybody reacts to it, deals with it, how it's solved, and
Yes.
the players involved. I think that's what totally draws me in. And on the fictional side, Law and Order, I think obviously they have a wonderful concoction there, where they have come up with a
Stories
really
over and over
good.
again. Yeah.
Yeah, but they take
Mhm.
stories from what's happening in this world
Mhm.
right now, in
Mhm.
our cities, and they use that, more from a little bit, obviously.
Which is
It's
why I
it's
think I
it's
like The
really
Rookie in
pretty
that
cool.
sense because they are taking story. I mean, they're including the issues that are going on presently in our world and putting them into the show. And I think I was watching old, like, the first season of Law and Order, and there were still real issues happening in our world. But I was like, wow, the way you're talking about this is very problematic, which is how it was talked about in real life too, which is why it's perpetuated through TV in that way. But it's like, ooh, I think now today, some shows are doing a better job of speaking about these issues in a better way.
And
So
they are, and if somebody says something in what's not a PC way,
yeah,
they call them on it in the show. So
in the
I think
show,
that's
right?
important too, to
I
remind
think so too.
people that some people still speak this way, but you shouldn't be
Right.
speaking this way, and they get
Exactly.
called on it,
Yes. If
right?
anything, TV is a mirror for us, so it
Right.
should reflect ways
For
that we
those of
should
us who are,
treat people.
but so the interesting thing is, for those of us who understand that and don't want to perpetuate those stereotypes, we're watching it, and we're
Mhm.
the we're the we're the
The
choir.
target
We
audience
need
is us.
yeah, we need the other people.
We need the other people. I know we do. We really do. Watch
Or if
more
they're
TV.
watching, yeah, if they're watching, they don't really get
No. Or they
necessarily that,
think
or
it's,
they
like,
just
against them still. Or like, "Oh, this
right,
show is too PC. I can't stand it."
right. Right.
Well, true crime. There's a lot to discuss here.
I know.
Yeah, I
I
know.
know. But I've got some stuff in my queue I've got to watch.
Same. I mean, every time I'm watching a true crime documentary and my partner's home or something, they're like, "Oh, you're another one?"
I do have to take a break
I
because I
know.
wonder, oh my God, am I watching too much of this? Maybe I
I
should
know.
watch a sitcom or something.